In 1934, the Pennsylvania Railroad began service for the annual Army-Navy game trains to Philadelphia's Municipal Stadium. Choosing Philadelphia as the site for the football rivalry was done for two key reasons. Philadelphia is equidistant between the two service academies and thus was considered neutral turf. And a large freight yard was adjacent to Municipal Stadium that could be transformed into a serviceable passenger terminal for game day. The last Saturday in November every year became the focus of a year-long effort by the Standard Railroad of the world to run passenger specials into that yard. The PRR's blueprint for the operation was designed by meticulous record-keeping on available motive power, passenger equipment, schedules, logistics, previous game requirements, and the weather. Even the wins and losses Army and Navy teams had that season would affect spectator turnout. During the early years, the PRR ran as many as 40 trains to the game. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad ran half that many. World War II curtailed the games from 1943 to 45. Service resumed in 1946, and the PRR ran game day trains up until the 1968 merger of the Penn Central. The PRR Army-Navy game service originated system-wide, having departures from New York, Trenton, Paoli, Wilmington, Baltimore, and Washington. All trains converged in Philadelphia at the temporary terminal in Greenwich Yard. Trains from New York, Trenton, and Paoli departed the main line at Zoo to traverse the normally freight-only West Philadelphia elevated branch to Arsenal. Then crossing the Schuylkill movable bridge down the 4-mile Delaware extension to Stadium and into Greenwich Yard. Trains from Wilmington, Baltimore, and Washington left the main line at Brill and moved through the Arsenal Y, following the same route to Greenwich Yard. From Stadium, trains entered Greenwich Yard to discharge passengers and moved then into specific track assignments. Restaging for departures followed the game. All motive power and passenger equipment were serviced, restocked, and cleaned. Large billboard letters were erected in the yard to assist passengers in locating their awaiting trains. Within minutes of the final gun ending the game, the first train would depart Greenwich Yard. The Delaware extension would become one-way outbound to Arsenal, and the exodus home would begin. Let's start out in 1955 and watch this grand spectacle unfold in its last decade of service. "1955 dawns with an overview looking west from the Broad Street overpass. Here we see on the Baltimore and Ohio running tracks the arrival of their first public train. First PRR train arriving from New York. First PRR train arriving from Washington. First Baltimore and Ohio train with Annapolis midshipmen arrives on the running tracks. Getting the B&O trains to Municipal Stadium required a unique move. Trains would arrive at East Side Yard in Philadelphia, and with the head-end power still coupled to the consist, pulled backwards by a Baldwin switcher to the Cinder Stadium platforms. This way the train was properly staged for departure after the game. First West Point train led by GG1 number 4885. This motor was an exception to the standard PRR painting practice, with a single wide stripe and a large experimental lettering. Second PRR train arriving from New York. Second PRR train arriving from Washington. Second PRR train arriving from New York. B&O train arrives at the cinder platforms hauling Reading Company coaches. Arriving side by side, 2 red GG1s. Our scenes in 1955 show all but one of the GG1s wearing the classic 5-stripe livery of the era. Included in this group are the 4 red GG1s in the 5-stripe livery painted for the 1952 stainless steel Congressional and Senator trains. Third PRR train from West Point arrives. On the point is the 4911, one of the 4 red GG1s. Red GG1 arrives from New York. Philadelphia Transportation Company trolleys on Broad Street pass by en route to the Navy Yard Loop on game day. 45 trolleys were in service for the game in 1955, down from 250 trolleys in previous years. In 1934, the Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company, and in the 1940s its successor, the Philadelphia Transportation Company, provided the local football fans service to Municipal Stadium on game day. Unfortunately, regular trolley service to the Navy Yard was terminated in December of 1957. The most impressive feature of the PRR's operations for the Army-Navy game trains was marshaling the fleet of GG1 motors. The best motors were picked and polished for review by the nation's top military, business, and political brass. Greenwich Yard departure preparations show the classic PRR lineup of GG1s. In later years, this dress-right dress formation of GG1s was diminished slightly by the introduction of MP-54 commuter cars. The entire operation of restaging the GG1s and departing trains was done without the use of two-way radio communications until 1964. After the game, the first train departing for New York is underway. On the adjacent track is the first departure for Washington, waiting the signal to move out. Note both pantographs on the GG1s are raised to ensure continuous contact with high wire in the yard. The first of 20 Army-Navy game trains for 1960 arrives with the first West Point train behind the GG1 number 4893. First PRR train arrives from New York, led by GG1 number 4874. First PRR train arriving from Washington. GG1 number 4936 has in tow RF&P coaches pressed into game day service. Second PRR train arrives from New York. with GG1 number 4880 head out. Second PRR train arrives from Washington. Third PRR train arrives from New York. Heavyweight Pullman cars are evident in this consist. Ever alert PRR CNS men stand by a relay case near the Broad Street overpass. Third PRR train arrives from Washington, led by GG1 number 4884. Pooling the vast amount of cars required for the Army-Navy Games was daunting. The PRR removed cars without sacrificing regular service by shortening certain trains a car or two. A freshly scrubbed 4905 handles the arrival of the fourth train from Washington. The fourth New York service train arrives behind the 4912. A classic PRR MP54 commuter train arrives near the Broad Street overpass with local Philadelphia football fans aboard. Red GG1 number 4907 arrives from New York with several PRR Pullman heavyweight cars that saw regular Army-Navy game service in later years. In the Pullman pool are two poets, John Greenleaf Whittier and James Russell Lowell. Painted in PRR Tuscan red, they are coupled together in this shot. Double-headed GG1 4917 and 4887 arrives from Washington with the Matthias W. Baldwin in the consist. MP54s from Paoli and Wilmington rattled their way into the game. From New York, the 4863 arrives with Army football fans aboard. In the early 1950s, the PRR upgraded 200 standard P-70 coaches. These modified P-70s show up in Army-Navy game trains, including those P-70s assigned to the Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines. Once the game was underway, the shifting and restaging of GG1 motors began. MP54s are moved into departure positions as a lady flag person directs traffic. Even the West Point mascot, the Army Mule, rode the standard railroad of the world to and from the game in style. From 1960 on, all GG1s in Army-Navy Game Service have the large keystone with single wide stripe livery. Numbers 4906 and 4907 stand out in the ranks as the only two GG1s painted red in this version of the single stripe paint scheme. We are positioned at the Arsenal Y in 1961, watching as trains come off the West Philadelphia Elevated Branch from the north and Brill interlocking from the south. The first MP-54s are an MU extra transporting PRR employees to Greenwich Yard before Army-Navy game trains arrive. GG1 number 4897 has the first West Point train coming off the West Philadelphia Elevated Branch. The large structure looming behind the trains is the Philadelphia Civic Center complex. GG1 number 4898 has the first New York in tow. .4892 has the second West Point cadet train. .4889 is in charge of the second New York train. By 1960, the unmodified P-70 coaches were gone from special service, and a noticeable evolution was taking place as the PRR began to trip lease passenger equipment from other railroads. PRR had its own fleet of Pullman-built parlor cars that were assigned to Army-Navy games. Parlors in this service were Upsal, Tulpehocken, and Trindle Spring. Coming from Washington, GG1 number 4887 has trip-leased RF&P coaches, as well as Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Line's P-70 coaches in its consist. .4877 from Washington tracks through the Y. History will serve the .4877 well, as it became the preserved red Jersey G in the 1980s. New York train. From Washington, carrying Washington football fans, the 4903 moves onto the Schuylkill Movable Bridge toward Greenwich Yard. Off the West Philadelphia Elevated Branch comes the 4930 from New York. GG1 4883 with its front pantograph up pulls the POTUS train with President Kennedy aboard through Arsenal. POTUS is a Secret Service code name for President of the United States. The consist has 2 U.S. Army communication cars, several parlor cars, a diner, and the official PRR business car, the Pennsylvania. MP-54s with the Paoli Special to the Army-Navy game growl their way through Arsenal. MP-54 multiple unit cars were first introduced to the game in 1958. More Washington fans are pulled behind the 4927. Nice view of 2 inbound stadium trains off the West Philadelphia Elevated Branch. The 4935 from New York and the MP-54 MUs. MP-54 MUs from Wilmington clacked their way through the Arsenal Y. By 1960, 4 MU specials were running on game day. 2 from Paoli, 1 from Wilmington, and 1 from Trenton. GG1 number 4910, previously seen red paint, hauls its New York train to the stadium. At Stadium, the 4883, in charge of the POTUS Special, has its pantograph inspected by PRR officials prior to departure. The POTUS train received special handling as it was backed out of Stadium and wide at Arsenal and returned to Greenwich Yard to join the post-game lineup of GG1s. Looking west past the Broad Street overpass for the first time, we see PRR EP-22 diesels hauling West Point cadet trains. West Point cadets traveled to the game on New York Central coaches. The handoff between the NYC diesels and the PRR motors for these trains was National Junction in Jersey City. In 1962, removal of catenary from the Jersey City branch necessitated use of PRR EP-22 diesels for the movement of these trains on game day. First PRR train arriving from New York. First PRR train arriving from Washington. Second PRR train arrives from New York. Second PRR train arrives from Washington. Third PRR train arrives from New York. Heavyweight Pullman cars are evident in this consist. The Pullman Company still maintained in the 1960s a large fleet of unassigned heavyweight cars that were held in reserve at the PRR Sunnyside Yard in Long Island City. The Army-Navy trains were made up from this equipment pool. Cars appear in the Pullman two-tone gray livery and some in colors from the railroads they were last assigned to. The fourth train from Washington. Fourth PRR train arrives from Washington. POTUS arrives behind 3 EP-22 diesels from Washington for the first time. The reason for the change was caused the previous year. The GG-1 assigned to POTUS created severe electrical interference with the U.S. Army communications cars, and the military did not want to repeat performance. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just concluded, and the President could not be out of the command and control communications loop. MP-54s with the Paoli Special, New York train. MP-54 MUs from Wilmington. Double-headed GG-1s numbers 4931 and 4923 from Washington, with PRR class POS 211 observation car Alexander Johnson Cassatt brings up the markers. classic PRR MP54 commuter train arrives near the Broad Street overpass with local Philadelphia football fans aboard. Few numbers for the year 1962. The PRR carried 7,000 passengers in 250 cars in 18 trains in Army-Navy game service. Reduction of passengers from previous years is a reflection of increased use of chartered buses, automobiles, and televising of the game. Looking west from the Broad Street overpass, trains move toward stadium interlocking. President Kennedy helicoptered to the Philadelphia Navy Yard and motorcaded to Municipal Stadium in an open convertible. He returned to Washington by train after the game. The West Philadelphia Elevated Branch, viewed from 31st Street in Philadelphia, shows GG1s after the game heading to New York. The Philadelphia Museum of Art is a beautiful backdrop for the Paoli-bound MP54s. Another New York-bound Army-Navy game train transits the High Line. First West Point arrives behind EP-22s, numbers 5713, 5806. After the 1957 season, the B&O ceased passenger operations to the Army-Navy games. The PRR picked up the service for only 1 year in 1958 and transported the midshipmen from Baltimore to Municipal Stadium. In subsequent years, the Navy traveled to the games from Annapolis to the stadium on a fleet of charter buses. First, New York arrives with the 4918 in the lead. .4925 from New York has in tow Long Island cars with a history. In the mid-60s, the PRR sold off many parlor cars to the Long Island Railroad. These cars were then leased back for Army-Navy specials, wearing Long Island blue and gray paint. Queen Mary, the PRR's last open platform parlor observation car, is pressed into Army-Navy game duty. 4878 arrives at stadium and signals the flagman in the yard. New MP85 Silverliners move through stadium and snake their way into Greenwich Yard. GG1 number 4930 from Washington rolls under the Broad Street overpass and enters Greenwich Yard. Note the engineers in the cabs of passing GG1s. Bells ringing as they approach stadium interlocking. The engine man reaches for the cord to sound 2 short blasts of the horn when he gets the flagman's signal to pass stadium and enter the yard. .4876 enters stadium interlocking on the east side of Broad Street. MP85 Silverliners roll seamlessly through stadium interlocking, with suburban Philadelphia football fans bound for the game. MP54s from Wilmington arrive with Municipal Stadium in the background. The flags around the stadium fly at half-mast. The Bud-built MP85 Silverliners arrived and bumped the MP54s off all but the Wilmington sections of the game day trains. GG1s being shifted through Greenwich Yard during the game, getting trains prepped for the post-game departure. Utilization of Greenwich Yard as a passenger terminal was accomplished several ways. All freight traffic was banned for 12 hours on game day. 3 trains were berthed on each yard track, nose to tail. The lead GG1s on the first train were uncoupled and run around through the yard and coupled to the rear of the last train in, thus becoming the first train out from that yard track. The GG1s on the third and second trains moved forward to couple to the rear of the trains ahead. Staged in this manner, each train had a GG1 on its head end waiting for the post-game departure. On standby near Stadium on game day was a spare GG1. It was held in protect service in the event any motors on the special trains failed. MP85 Silverliners enter Greenwich Yard through the stadium interlocking. A dirty pair of GG1s, numbers 4919 and 4886, bring the first New York train into Greenwich Yard. In 1964 and 65, the GG1s looked dirty and worn. The fortunes of the PRR were in decline. Money spent on appearances were not in the cards. Because the West Philadelphia Elevated Branch, the Delaware Extension, and Greenwich Yard were freight-only territories, pilot engineers boarded trains at Zoo and Brill to assist unqualified passenger road engineers on game-bound trains. A clean 4922 with the first train arriving from Washington. MP54s from Wilmington arrive carrying few passengers to the game. Second New York comes in also with a few passengers for the game. The whole fleet of PRR's MP85s appears to be in Army-Navy game service this year. GG1s shifting in Greenwich Yard during the game, staging for a quick departure. West Point cadet trains were backed out of Greenwich Yard Street Station's Penn Coach Yard for servicing. Late Saturday evening, the trains would be positioned in Philadelphia Suburban Station with GG1s for power set up for an early Sunday morning departure. The GG1s were cut off at 30th Street Station, where EP22s would take over for the run to National Junction in Jersey City. Looking east through the Broad Street overpass, PRR MP85 clomped their way into the Greenwich Yard past the Stadium Tower. MP54s in Wilmington service arrived with Army-Navy fans. GG1's numbers 4903 and 4926 move a train out of Greenwich during the game. This move is presumably for servicing the equipment at Penn Coach Yard. Looking a bit grimy and worn, GG1s shift in Greenwich Yard, keeping up the tradition of Army-Navy game service for another year. We close here with a look at the last open platform parlor car in service on the PRR. The Queen Mary represents the grand style and finest tradition the standard railroad of the world had to offer with its Army-Navy game trains.